Attend AutoCon 2 in Denver, November 20th through 22nd, 2024. You'll hear presentations about network automation from hands-on engineers who built automation systems for their company and have the scars to prove it. Conference pricing is not high, but this is a boutique event with limited tickets. Go to networkautomation.forum/AutoCon2 to register today.
Welcome to Total Network Operations, the podcast dedicated to all you hardworking network operators that deliver all the packets and love collaborating together. Here on the GitNops podcast, we talk about org and process issues, the NetOps tech stack, vendor solutions geared for operations, and how it all needs to work together. Our goal is to put a bright light on best practices in NetOps so you can take away useful ideas and make informed decisions for your network. I'm here today again with Tom McGonagle. Tom is the creator of a concept and framework called GitNops, and we're picking up where we left off last time and ready to dive back in on some of the details of GitNops. So why don't you just sum up real quickly, Tom, from the last episode on DevOps best practices and how they feed directly into GitNops?
Yeah. Hi, Scott. Thank you for having me. And so welcome everyone back to the second episode. So as we discussed in the first episode, there are 7 DevOps practices, and they are configuration management, continuous integration, automated testing, infrastructure as code, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, and continuous monitoring. And each of those practices is like exemplified in my GitHub Actions-based GitNops. And so there's a bunch of stuff that's kind of in there to unpack in terms of tooling and why it's important, but I'm just going to turn it back over to you, Scott.
So let's start with the whole code repository function and the role that GitHub plays in that today. Knowing it's not the only tool, but why is GitHub so popular for source code management? What's so special about it?
Yeah, so people don't realize this, and it's kind of an amazing part of it. But so Linus Torvalds actually was the creator of Git, right? And so he created Linux and he created Git, and he's created billions of dollars of value in the world, right? It's just amazing. And I think it was because of and they used Git originally with the Linux project, and then the Git tooling got open sourced and people started using it for other things. And then these kind of very smart entrepreneurs started GitHub, and people have started other kind of competitive firms like GitLab, or even Atlassian has their own Git-based sharing tool. And so what GitHub allows you to do is this easy way to share software. And if anyone hasn't had this experience where they have a Git, they have a Git handle, right? Mine is my last name, McGonagle. I got into GitHub in the very, very early days. And I think I was in like the first 100,000 users, and now there's 100 million, Scott. I was in the very first, group of people. And so you have this GitHub repository, and you want to make a copy of it. There's this push button functionality, Scott, that you just press fork, right? And so that creates a fork, and now it's under your account. So if it was under Scott's account, it's something, or you want to fork GitNops, you can do that. You can go to github.com/McGonagle/GitNops, or you can go to gitnops.com, and that'll take you there as well. But you can hit fork, and then you get a copy of this repository, the software repository, and then you can make changes to it. And then something that we talked about in the last call is you create a pull request for changes that you made. And so it's this what you do is you make changes to the fork copy, and then you push those fork changes back to the original copy using something called a pull request. So just this kind of minor kind of overview of a process that I just gave is screaming collaboration, Scott. It's just so highly collaborative. And so that's my answer, right? The reason why GitHub and Git are so popular is that incredible collaboration that it allowed, that comes from the Linux project originally. Yeah.
So when I hear fork, I should understand that as copy, right? Mm-hmm. My pull requests are just the deltas, or only the changes that I've made?
Yeah, it's the request to pull in the changes that you made, that Scott made. That's right.
Got it. Right. Mm-hmm. And so that's a merge back into a bigger version that other people are working on. Yep.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, that's all in the context of developing software. We're talking about network device configs here. So what does that look like for router configs, switch configs, firewall configs, load balancer configs? Because you were an F5 guy. I can't leave them out.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. And so at the very least, you described it as configs, right? So they're text documents with all the different configuration information that's going to be uploaded, right? So at the very least, everyone, I'd argue, should be using Git or something like Git to manage their configs. But what we're really talking about with GitNops is taking the configs and then modeling them as infrastructure as code and using tools like Terraform or Ansible or there's some like bespoke tooling, like Cloudflare has some like cloud-based, like CLI command line tools, or Postman, right? So Postman is kind of my quintessential kind of favorite example that I go over. But let's just start with Terraform. So let's say there, for your device, for your network device, du jour, right, your favorite one, there's a Terraform provider, right? And so the Terraform provider has the ability to configure and command and control your network device. And so we'll just call it network device A, right? And this network device A configured by Terraform has a configuration, and that configuration is in HCL, HashiCorp configuration language, and that would be stored in the Git repository. And then what you do is you'd run GitHub Actions, which would pull in, so Terraform is a single binary. It's a Go binary. It's a Go language binary, and so it would pull in the Terraform binary into a container, and it would pull in your configuration, your HCL that you defined in your repo, and it would run that Terraform against that network device in your management LAN with GitNops. And that's kind of the architecture. That's kind of it's very, very simplest, right? And so when in our last convo, in our last podcast, we talked about just the benefits of modeling your network devices in HCL, for that matter, or just infrastructure as code. And I'm just going to repeat them here because I think they're important. You get repeatability, you get scalability, agility, documentation. The word for that is reassurance, and then disaster recovery. So if that network device were to have a problem, you'd be able to recreate the configuration of it quickly and easily and kind of painlessly using that Terraform. And then on top of that, having the configuration of that Terraform configuration saved in a very, very safe way in a Git repository such as GitHub, right? So there's, and anyone on your team could do it, right? Everyone on your team would have access to that configuration, and they can collaborate on it. They can make changes. They could push that out in the event of a disaster recovery or some configuration mishap.
But if everyone on my team has access to it, maybe I don't want the summer intern having the same access that everybody else does. Mm-hmm. What kind of checks? What checks are in place to make sure that, being able to collaborate among such a large team is great, but we have to watch out for errors?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So GitHub itself has all these RBAC capabilities, right? And so in our previous talk, we talked about the difference between continuous deployment and continuous delivery, right? So I would argue that only you as the boss should have the keys of the kingdom to push out those changes, maybe for a network, a very, very impactful network configuration, right? So that's all kind of like specific and specifiable with GitHub as well. So only Scott R would have access, and that's all referred to as role-based access control, and then that's all kind of facilitated by authentication authorization at the GitHub level. And so all those features that you're kind of concerned about are there in the design. Yeah.
You just gave me a huge promotion to the boss. I wasn't expecting that in this episode.
Well, you deserve it, Scott.
Thank you for that. And now that I'm in this leadership position, I need to apologize to all the summer interns out there. No disrespect intended to all those hardworking folks early in their career. No, yep. I was a co-op student as an undergrad, and co-ops were like the best internships you get paid for. And
those are fantastic.
Learn what you want to do and learn what you don't want to do. But anyway, so Tom, you mentioned the use of automated testing from DevOps in GitNops. How do we do automated testing for configs going into a network environment? We can't use the production network for test. Don't tell vendors that. What are you using to test configs before you declare them ready to push out into production?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to kind of hedge my answer. So with GitNops, and it's not obvious, but with GitHub Actions, you have the ability to wire in not just that Terraform Terraform run that I mentioned before, but you can also have the ability to put in all these other additional containers that run on your code, that run on the Terraform code, that run on the HCL. And so there's a tool called TerraScan that does all the security scanning of your Terraform, and then there's something called linting, which is this kind of bizarre old-fashioned software development reference, but it refers to getting the lint out of your dryer, right? Your clothes dryer. And so you have this ability to do linting, you have this ability to do security scanning, you can do secret scanning, in case there were all these secrets that can end up in your Terraform code and all this other stuff. And so you have this ability to do, very pervasive, very important, very interesting testing of the code to make sure that it's, quote unquote, okay and compliant. But that's different from what you're talking about. You're talking about, like does network device A actually support API called, ABC, right? And so, I don't think we're kind of there yet, except, in the previous conversation, we were talking about like a digital twin. I think that's like a good use case, right? So like, or you were to have some sort of test infrastructure to test against, and I think the challenge with something like network automation is like, handling those errors. Like let's say it doesn't, version, X of the network device A doesn't support, this particular API call, but like you kind of aren't, it's not really clear. It's not, you'd have to dig into the documentation to find that. You kind of only discover it through an error state, right? And so handling that type of stuff is really, really kind of hard. And I think this kind of surfaces something I mentioned in the previous one, is just how tedious a lot of this stuff can be, right? A lot of the automated testing and a lot of the infrastructure as code, development can be, but, I don't really have a good answer for that. I've spent, a large portion of my infrastructure as code career, doing tedious, spinning up a VM, trying something, didn't work, spinning it down, spinning up a VM, trying something again, didn't work, doing, and just wrote over and over stuff. And I think we're still kind of stuck in that pattern, particularly with the networking devices.
Well, so there's the emergence of, virtual only environments, right? I think Container Lab is getting a lot of note. And not to endorse any particular product in the context of this show, but having some virtualized environment where I can mock up the production network. Like I could have virtual machines or containers that represent every network element in the network. Depends on how big your network is. Enterprise versus carrier could have very different scale concerns, but I need some kind of virtualized environment where I can both push the configs and see if I get the intended results, right? And then I can use automated testing in that virtualized environment to say, am I getting the results that I think I should be getting? For example, a BGP peering between two of the virtualized, test devices. I know what I think I'm sending, and all my configs could be syntactically correct, but I could have a logical error in my BGP policy, for example. And that automated testing that I would develop for the virtual environment could be the same test that I use for post checks in the physical environment, right? I can use the same logic to say, hey, am I getting all the routes that I'm supposed to get, right? That I'm on track here. That's the same kind of thing you're talking about here for automated testing within a network environment?
Yeah, no, absolutely. As you were kind of explaining yourself, I've always kind of toyed around with this kind of scale, this highly parallelizable aspect of GitNops, right? So
right.
you have in your management LAN, you have a Kubernetes cluster, for example, or a suite of hosts that are running these containers, that are running Terraform or running Postman or whatever, and you could have one for every network device. And so, I think an answer to some of these solutions is having very, very, very fast rollback, right? And I'm curious how that lands with you. Is that a potentiality, or is it just you better be right, the first time?
Rollback is awesome, right? And so very early on in my, looking at Juniper Networks and actually landing at Juniper Networks in 2000, the fact that they already had rollback implemented within a single device was very, very, so it's funny, there's this little miniature environment within that operating system, Junos, that lets you edit a candidate config, but it doesn't go live until you commit the config. So you're literally pushing it into production on the individual router. I've never connected these dots before, but there's some principles here that kind of mimic some of the things we're talking about. And I think by default, the last 50 changes are always tracked, and you can extend, that commit history if you'd like, right? So, and you can roll back to any one of those previous versions. Again, this example is just within a single router, within a single network device. You're talking about being able to do this for large pieces of the network and perhaps to the whole network.
Yeah, exactly. And where I'm kind of going with my thinking is something you and I have privately discussed quite a bit, and it's systems thinking, right? And so I
Yep.
just what's coming up for me is this is like a systems thinking problem, right? And
Yep.
and specifically there's DSRP in systems thinking, and it's discovering the distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives of a particular system, right? And so as a practicing systems thinker, I kind of go through that often, but it's those relationships that's really kind of like jumps out at me. Is you have this configuration and there's like a misconfiguration, and or specifically the need to test the configuration before it gets rolled out and so forth. But you better be darn sure the relationships in that configuration are very well understood, particularly with your BGP example and so forth. And so that's coming up for me.
Yeah, systems thinking is one of the things that attracted me to this whole conversation last year, right? Being intentional about how all your processes and your tools and your tech stack work together. Don't just get focused on your automation tooling or what you're using for telemetry and observability, right? There are boundaries that need to be spanned there. And you got to think about the dependencies between all the tools in the tech stack and all the devices in the network that they touch. Yep, for sure. You keep mentioning the scary K word that is a mythical beast to many network engineers. What role does Kubernetes play here? Can you tease that out for us?
Yeah. So with GitHub Actions, there's actually a project, it's a Kubernetes project called the GitHub Actions Runner Controller. And so what it is, it's a Kubernetes software that you install on a Kubernetes cluster, and then that Kubernetes Actions Runner Controller, it's a mouthful, software remotely connects back up to GitHub and then monitors a repo, and then it downloads the configuration for the GitHub Actions, and it runs the GitHub Actions locally, because the alternative is to run GitHub Actions in GitHub, right, in their cloud, right? And so what does that get you for a network, right? So my design leverages GitHub Actions Runner Controller on a distro of Kubernetes, and SUSE has a bunch of them, right? They have the RKE2 Kubernetes distro, and they also have K3S, which is like this minimal embedded version of Kubernetes. It's really, really nice. And so you could run on K3S, a K3S cluster in your management LAN, and then really all it's doing is just sitting there listening to GitHub for actions, right? And then when it hears of an action, like a Postman action or a Terraform action, it downloads a container and runs it locally. And in my example of having, like, say, 100 network devices that attach this or that are on this management LAN, you could spin up 100 containers and manage and command and control those different network devices with this one management LAN Kubernetes cluster. And I just love that scalability, and that and then the kind of the advantages of Kubernetes is like it's highly available, it's reliable, it's scalable. Once again, it's and I know how scary Kubernetes can be, because it's kind of like kind of a new undertaking, or kind of a new, hard new undertaking. But to be honest with you, Scott, I've never had as powerful a superhero feeling as I have when I'm using Kubernetes. Like, it makes me feel like a superhero. Yeah. No.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. No. I'm serious. Like, it really, like, you're like, and I'll give you a perfect example of it. Like, you're like, okay, this task is going to take me, 4 hours. Well, it takes 20 minutes, right? There's something at play there. The interface is really well defined. There's one API, there's one CLI, for interacting with it. And once you've kind of figured out the way that works, you can fly, like Superman, or even Batman in the bat plane,
Or that you've got the grappling gun, and at least you
of
can
course.
fly up to the top of the building. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, so how Kubernetes literate do I need to be? Like, do I need somebody on the team that's moderately experienced, highly experienced?
Thanks for asking the question. Yeah. So you don't need any. So the K3S installation is like one command for one node. It's like two, so if you had a couple nodes, you have 3 nodes, it's 3 commands, right? It's very, very simple. If anyone wants to check it out, it's k3s.sh. And then to install the GitHub Actions Runner control, it's very, very simple. Kind of takes some so you're talking about like 4 lines of CLI commands to get a GitHub Actions Runner controller configured and talking to GitHub, and then you're kind of ready to go off and use it. So you don't need really any Kubernetes experience. However, that would make me nervous as an individual if I was running this mission critical, management land technology, and I didn't know how to like keep it up, And so I think it's a good question, because in my career as a kind of a systems guy, I've had to you're gonna laugh, Scott, but I've had to like re-educate and kind of tool like every 18 months. I've had to learn something, something particularly new, and Kubernetes has some really, really deep, difficult technical networking components, right? And I think that's one thing that I notice all these like app developers really struggling with, is like the networking stuff like blows their mind out of the back of their head, And so but our networking brothers could very easily and very, very very easily get into that and understand it and get good at that, and that's going to be like a real skill, because fundamentally Kubernetes is a multi-cloud technology. You can Kubernetes in Azure is the same thing as Kubernetes, and Google is the same thing as Kubernetes and AWS, et cetera. So I'd say it's a valuable skill.
Yep. No, look, I think that's something that everybody needs to keep in mind, right? The whole nature of being in tech and information technology is disruption and new tooling. And, you're not alone, right? I'm in the 3rd act of my career, but I've really enjoyed picking new stuff up along the way. And in particular, my engagement with the Network Automation Forum and all the, I knew quite a lot about network automation coming into helping found that with Chris Grundeman. But the stuff that I've learned in the last year and a half, just by engaging, I love it. I'm a lifelong learner, and you don't have to call yourself a lifelong learner to get that you need to be ready to keep learning new tools, new paradigms, new technologies all along the way. And along these lines, we have another conference coming up in November 2024 in Denver, and we're going through all the proposals for workshops, and definitely more on Kubernetes, Kubernetes networking and extending Kubernetes for network automation are topics that have been asked for. We'll see what actually makes it into the final agenda for the November event, but there are people that are asking for things like this. So there is some pull, it's not just push.
Yeah, that's great. That's well put. Yeah, I love it.
So this is a good point to ask this question. You're talking about specific tools that are all useful in GitNops here. Everybody, even with open source, people want to be careful about being too locked in to a single tool for any one of the processes or piece of the puzzle. What's the state of being able to swap tools in and out for some of the things you've mentioned here? Like, we know that Terraform has just made some licensing changes, and now there's this thing called OpenTofu. Are those going to be interchangeable? Are those going to be options for IAC? Talk to that a little bit.
Yeah. So really the criteria is containerization ability. It's kind of a mouthful, right? So can the tool be containerized? And so OpenTofu can be swapped in trivial, in 2 seconds for Terraform, right? And then I mentioned, today Ansible, GitHub GitNops supports Ansible, it supports Terraform, it supports OpenTofu, it supports CLI's tooling, it supports Postman, and kind of it's anything that can be containerized in the GitHub Actions portfolio. And if you go to the GitHub Actions marketplace, you could see you could do a Google search to see if your favorite tool is there, and if it is, you're ready to go. It's just as simple as that. Or you could create it yourself, right? And so that takes a little bit of like kind of Docker container work, but it's not that hard.
A quick interruption to tell you about AutoCon 2, the 3rd in the AutoCon conference series about network automation. Only, don't think of AutoCon as a typical conference. Instead, AutoCon is a gathering of the networking industry to work towards a standardized approach to network automation. And this is a hard problem. Equipment vendors have a vested interest in selling you their automation tools, but let me guess, you're a multi-vendor shop. There are so many open source tools you could bring into your automation stack that it can be overwhelming. And if you want to integrate with products like ServiceNow, that is an added complexity. If you've tried moving from simple Python scripts to a robust automation system the business can rely on, you know what I'm getting at. And this is why the Network Automation Forum exists, why the AutoCon conference series exists, and why you should attend AutoCon 2 in real time in Denver, November 20th through 22nd, 2024. Hear the talks, interact with the speakers, talk to other attendees in the hallway track, meet the people making automation tools, talk to vendor experts who live and breathe this stuff. You're going to leave with solid ideas about how to approach network automation for your company, ideas that will impact the business that you support in a very positive way. Register at networkautomation.forum/AutoCon2. And I don't mean to sound dramatic, but don't wait, because this event is almost certainly going to sell out, and the venue only holds so many humans. There really is a ticket cap. Again, that's networkautomation.forum/AutoCon2, and I hope to see you in Denver. And now, back to the podcast.
What do you think about the potential for shrink wrap solutions for doing GitNops or something like GitNops versus the shops where there are people who are very implementation friendly and able? Some people like to roll their own. Some people want to click OK to install.
Yeah, so I mean, I feel that as part of this foray into like kind of a software development kind of mindset, requires some coding on your own. And so when I say coding, I mean cobbling together a GitHub Actions workflow, or cobbling together a Docker container. Or this is I'm a realist. That's not for everybody.
Right.
But like I think the benefits are really outweigh the negatives. Like you mentioned the lifelong learning, and I hate to be the bad guy, but lifelong learning is valuable because it'll keep you employed. If you decide to not be a lifelong learner and you put a brakes on stuff, it's going to be a problem for you at some point. And so if you're the shrink wrap kind of focused org, I would caution you. I'd give you strong caution against really kind of following that path, because the more skills you have, the more it's not only skills, but like the more learning that you're doing about how other organizations and other teams, going to NAF, or going to these different conferences and learning this stuff. And this is all so important. And it's forgive the expression, Scott, but it's like existential. It's like, are you going to survive in this profession or not? It requires it, I'd argue.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just to touch on a related topic, then, what's your thought on generative AI tools coming along and being able to do more and more of basic coding for you? Are you happy? Are you nervous? Are you both? What's your state of the art there, or your assessment?
Yeah. So I try to be as optimistic about tech as humanly possible, and I am kind of an optimist, kind of a just personally an optimist. And so, with the generative AI stuff that's available to GitNops today, there's Copilot, right? So that's GitHub's generative AI. And so you can use GitHub Copilot today with GitNops to generate Terraform code, and then Postman has their Postbot, right? So I like to use Postbot just as much as I like to use Terraform for GitNops. And so you can create tests, and you can create some content, some API stuff with Postbot as well. And so, to kind of answer your question, I'm very, very positive and optimistic about this stuff. I think it's going to be very, very powerful. I think it's going to supersede, something that I think is going to supersede is like low code, efforts, right? I think people will just go into generative AI, and it'll be useful and powerful, and kind of summarize, I've always, and I've had the chance to say this a couple times, but not on this podcast yet, or the previous one with you yet, that I think that automation is really an 80-20 rule. I think you should focus on, on getting rid of 80% of the toil with automation, and getting rid of and focusing on 80% of the job with automation. I think that's true of these generative AI things. I think it's maybe a little bit more, like 90%, but you're not going to get complete coverage. And then it's going to allow you, whether it's automation or whether it's generative AI or whether it's generative AI automation, you're going to get to a point where you're able to concentrate on the 20% of the job that's the hardest, that requires the most effort and is the most interesting, is the most architecty. You'll be working on as the networking architect, and you'll be focused on it. And you'll be doing a great job, and you can just kind of let the robot take care of the other stuff. But I know that's a hard concept for people to kind of appreciate. But I am an eternal optimist, I guess.
No, I'm in the same boat as you. I think there's incredible potential for really useful work to be done here. I think there's going to be impacts, right? And it might shrink certain job categories, but it can create others. I think it's important to acknowledge that, and we just have to wait and see and give people opportunities to skill up, right? And certainly, if you're the person who wants to skill up, that's going to play to your advantage. I can also bring this back to Batman, right? So every once in a while, Batman needed some new tools. He never had all the tools he needed all the time, but he has the resources of Wayne Enterprises and the guys in the lab coming up with the new tooling, right? So he's equipped with 80% of the tools most of the time, but every once in a while he needs to acquire some new skills. I mean, new tools from those resources.
I love that. Yeah. That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah. I love it.
So let's turn a corner here and talk about maybe more traditional network engineering and operations organizations who have not bought into DevOps or GitNops, but they're thinking about it. And they're worried about, man, this is process heavy. There's a lot of new stuff here that I've never had to do before. And there's a lot of new tools and tech that I'm going to need to skill up in some way, in the Moneyball model that is my NetOps team, right? Where do you start? You can't do it all at once. What would be your recommendation to companies or organizations interested in going down this path?
Yeah. So for me, it's Git, right? It's getting used to Git, and I have told this to others before. I'd be curious if you agree, but every single network engineer who's listening to this should have their own GitHub profile, right? And why is that? Well, GitHub is just as much the nerdy LinkedIn as it is anything else, right? And so
sure.
You kind of and so if you go to my GitHub github.com/McGonagle account, you'll see I have this. It's very West Coast, by the way. You noticed it, and you mentioned it in the previous podcast. But there's a README, right? So software comes with a README. So on the West Coast, within GitHub, they promote this idea of having a Tom, McGonagle README or Scott README, and so that's what's there. But you can use it for to socialize, and you can use it to promote yourself and so forth. And so for that reason, you should have your own GitHub account. But we're kind of getting back to the Git skills. Get a sense of what it takes to do a pull request, right? And believe it or not, I didn't really kind of understand pull requests, so I used the GitHub desktop tool, right? It's actually kind of graphical, and what's the pull request? The name threw me off. I didn't quite understand what I was pulling in, but you're asking someone else to pull it in. That's kind of the difference. And so, and then there's a wonderful, really, really well designed GitHub CLI. So if you're using Mac, you can use Brew to install. It's called GH, and you can do almost anything with it. And you can launch Copilot, you can launch code spaces, you can interact with the projects and all these other things. But really just kind of start in that ecosystem and get a sense for kind of what's going on in that GitHub ecosystem and how beneficial it is. If you're not storing your this is a bad example, but if you're not storing your operating system configs like your Z shell RC or your bash RC, think about it. You can store them as private repos. No one will see them, but they'll be there, and you're saving your own personal configs up there, and there's utility to getting used to it. But I can't. I'm trying my best, Scott, to advertise why it's so important to have Git skill. And it's not even just the advanced stuff like collaboration and collaborating with your peers and so forth, but it's personal, right? If people are, I've actually heard of this. People looking at your GitHub repositories to see what type of IT guy you are, what type of engineer you are, checking out your stuff, and so I think it's in everyone's best interest to just start with a GitHub profile. and get some code, whether it's their own personal, and it doesn't have to be, code. It could be Word documents, believe it or not. You can create a private repo, and you can version control, Word documents up in GitHub. And so, just getting started on that, I think is just the critical part of it. Just one
Sure.
foot in front of the other.
Yep. And that's, I think that's important to call out too. Even at its base, GitHub is not just for storing code or router configs or scripts. It's really a versioned file management system.
Correct.
Right. And you can, yep. And you can create as many copies of something as you want and eat up as much space, and then start paying GitHub for the space that you're using. But it takes a lot to get to that point. No, that's a really good practical piece of advice. And funny enough, separate from us having talked about this, about 6 weeks ago, I picked up a nice Humble Bundle group of PDFs, and one of them is Learning Git, and it is open here on my desktop. And I've done little things with Git over the past few years, but it's like, no, I really need to start to understand this better. I'm never going to be somebody in a big production network again. Well, who knows? Who knows what the future holds? But right. I've always learned by doing, and just getting around and playing with it. Installing the graphical interface on my Mac here. I just did that the other day. So yeah, I agree with you 100%. And we did not collaborate on that answer. I threw that at Tom, out of the blue here. What else? Any other advice? So that's for individuals who are going to need to interact with Git and source code control. What about leadership? The frontline managers, the director level folks that are trying to justify to their management, hey, we really think GitNops is going to be very useful to us. How do they start building a case for that? What are some nuggets that you would throw them in their justifications?
Well, I'd love to collaborate with you on this answer. So, one of the big things that really is prominent or has been prominent in DevOps, and I noticed it in the recent CrowdStrike issue, is all the DevOps people are like, oh, hug ops, which is like a thing. Hug ops to those guys, sorry that you're going through this and stuff. But there was like this concept of post-mortem or blameless post-mortems,
Right.
And I've always been struck by how different it is for the network engineers. If you make a mistake as a network engineer, you potentially can get fired. It's not the same for the DevOps or even the application developer engineers. And so, my message to the leadership, I guess, is, is it possible that for our network brothers to be less fearful? Is it possible for there to be more blameless cultures within network operations? I don't know the answer to that. I'd be curious what you think.
Yeah, I think there's a real responsibility for leaders, both formal people leaders, managers, and individual contributors with positions of responsibility and personalities that lend themselves to it, to help create that blameless environment. Like, I've always taken this back to, you need to create an environment where it's okay to ask questions. Forget about even failing. There are some cultures where you ask a question that reveals that you didn't read a certain document, and there are, people ready to start a flame war, right? And that was something very early in my tech career, where it was kind of more the Wild West internet, and people were ready to show all the time how much smarter they were than everybody else.
Yeah.
You call it toxic behavior, call it what you want. Boy, if you create an environment where it's okay to ask questions and even okay to fail, you'll be able to try more things. You'll be able to do more small experiments. You'll get to closure on issues faster. And that's, that doesn't happen overnight, right? That takes impacting the culture of an organization. Many more podcast episodes to be spent on topics like that, for sure. Let me bring this back to, and we're starting to wrap this up here. I noticed in listening to you and reading about you that you're just very wired for collaboration. What has driven you in that way? What are the things that make that so appealing to you?
Yeah, so I think if you go all the way back to family, right? So my grandfather was a teacher, but he was a union, a teachers union organizer. My mom was a union leader, and she was a civil servant. My father was a civil servant before he went into private practice. And then I think I think something you picked up on when I first talked to you is that on my README on github.com/McGonagle, there's a discussion about Boy Scouts and how important that was to me. I was a Boy Scout for 8 years, and so this concept of service was very important. But this service was part of it. But then I did have extremely positive teamwork experiences in sports. I did play American football for 8 years. I played all through college. I played for 4 years before that, and to say those experiences were positive, it doesn't give it justice. And like American football is this tremendous teamwork experience, right? Just the whole coordination of all these individual specialists. It's kind of how I think about DevOps, right? You have all these individual specialists like network operators and they're all developers and so forth, and they're all working in concert. And so I'd say team. The combination of my family background and then the Boy Scouts and then football. It's interesting that you picked up on that. Like, I don't even think about something like from not a team perspective, as an as like an individual perspective. Like everything I approach is like, how can we do? Even my family, I have a young family. How do we do this as a team? Everything's teamwork. But I think it was the combination of those three things.
I think like that's more than lip service to teamwork. Anybody who's been working with teams, right, in their career, and you're always part of a team, right? Mm-hmm. You can just say the words and let people do all their little individual things, or you can really put substantive policies and behaviors in place that really increase collaboration. And I think that's one of the things that strikes me about DevOps and how GitNops takes this. It's really about radical collaboration. And, that's antithetical to some of the behaviors that we've seen in, the whole development of the internet thing, right? If you could go and you could be the Lone Ranger, you could be the cowboy, you could get things done. And that may have been very useful for getting the system off the ground. Now we're sustaining and scaling the system, and we need different behaviors in place to continue to grow with stability, right? And we do a lot better. It's a horrible proverb that I'll never get right. But if you want to go, if you go alone, you can go really fast. But if you go together, you'll go farther. And I've mangled that.
It's funny that you bring that up. So when I was growing up, my mom. So I have a disabled sister, and so my mom, I heard on the daily, the strong have to carry the weak, right? And so,
sure.
That was just, I heard that on the day every day, and so that was a big part of my life. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah, clearly that, and great handful of things you called out that had real influence on you. Well, Tom, this has been awesome. This will not be the last time you're on here. We'll make sure we bring you back for other more specific topics. You talked about GitNops.com. Where else would you point people to for info? Like, for example, learn GitHub. Where's a good place for people to go and do that?
Yeah, so believe it or not, it is GitHub.com. They have these wonderful tutorials right from the start page and so forth. And there's a lot of great learning available on GitHub.com for people and for people to get started with Git. And there's a bunch of really kind of good books. There's a learning series from O'Reilly, the Head Start series, and they have a great one on Git. That's probably my favorite Git book. It's kind of an interesting approach to learning Git. I liked it.
Well, definitely check those resources out. Make sure you look at Tom's GitNops.com. Hit him up on LinkedIn. He's a real collaborator. You reach out, I'm sure he'll get back to you. And we haven't met in person yet, but we're going to see each other in a few weeks at a USNUA event up in Vermont, the network user group there. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm sure we'll have some interesting conversation while we're there with other networkers. And maybe we'll collaborate a little bit on what that night's going to look like. I'll have my presentation, but I'm sure we'll work you into that. Tom, great to have you, sir.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, everyone else, for tuning into Total Network Operations. This is a living project, and this topic in particular, adapting DevOps to network operations, is going to be a theme that we continue to pull at. If you have specific questions about this, we touched on so many different pieces of it. We could spend many more episodes on this. If there are specific things that you want us to have people on like Tom and others to to do deep dives on, let us know, give us feedback. There's the best practices part of this, but there's also how to help organizations and individuals adapt and change to technologies that are going to make networks more resilient and make operators' lives better. I really want to tease out those things and make that information consumable and useful to a wide audience. So drop me a DM on LinkedIn, send us a follow-up at packetpushers.net/FU, and see you next time on TNOps.